Good evening, Facebook family and online family overseas and all around the world. Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Thank you for being here tonight. Braddy, do tell folks about you. And tonight we are talking about Scarred. I have it on Kindle, so I see the book back there. Do tell us about the drop, the backdrop of the book, and about yourself.
Well, it's a three-book series. Well, first of all, my name's Braddy. I live in Harrisburg, PA. I've been living here for, gosh, forever. Married my husband right out of college and settled here. I am a retired teacher. I retired after almost 30 years of teaching. I'm currently working for the Big Brothers Big Sisters program of the Capital Region. I am a curriculum developer right now. And at one point, I was writing full time, but now I write part time. So, you got to squeeze it in. Yeah.
Yeah. So do tell us about the backdrop of Scarred, and you can tell us a little about the other one, but we'll come back in just in case those people are not on yet. But tell us about Scar and then a little snippet of what's to come after that.
Oh, okay. Well, like I said, Scarred is the first of a three-book series. Basically, I wrote these stories loosely based on real people. I always say I came from a family of storytellers. My parents, who were, oh, I don't know, I call them um, the descendants of the great Exodus because they were
Mm,
Southerners who came from the South to the North, just looking for, financial freedom, um, getting away from Jim Crow. And my father in particular used to tell me these stories. And when you're a kid, you half listen, but I was a weird kid, Ellen. I'd sit there and go like, because I always loved history. So I'd sit there and really, really soak up what he would say to me. But it never really dawned on me that these stories were story worthy, until I got older and I really, really started to write. And my father was gone by then. So my mother, came to live with us. And as she started to pick up the storytelling, she would tell me these amazing stories. And by the time I was an adult, I realized I needed to capture them. So I started writing them down in a notebook. She would talk and I would like, oh, wait a minute, don't say anything else. Let me go get a notebook. And I started collecting them and I realized that, born in that particular time, you really had the opportunity to see African American history come to life. So the premise of this is it's a story, it's a romance, but it really is the story of how a lot of poor African Americans who lived in the South escaped Jim Crow by coming to the North. In this particular story, there were two lovebirds who struggled with a lot of things going wrong in their lives, and together they moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where originally I'm from. So in this story, you have Ed and Mavis. And I think for me, listening to my father tell about a time when he had a friend who literally had to leave the South because they thought, he didn't think he was going to make it. He thought maybe he would be killed. So he left the South and he did not leave in, the most convenient way. So I took just that little bit of story and I started to make it the base of how the story sort of picks up. This couple who are in the South have to leave, and that's how they get to Pittsburgh, and that's how their love story starts to evolve.
yes, yes, yes. And I fell in love with those characters. And I want you to tell us about, because Ed Proctor had a very dark story to him. Tell us about Ed Proctor, also, of course, Mavis, and then there was one character. He probably had a small role, but it was major in some kind of way. He Silas. So tell
Mm-hmm.
us about that, and mom, because as reading it, you give us a little piece of dad, And we'll put your finger on that, and we'll talk about Dad a little bit. You really didn't mention his name or anything like that, but it was a exodus for him.
Mm. Well, it's funny because when I was writing this book, I kept thinking about people that I know. And Ed Proctor is a good friend of mine. I said to him, "Would you like to be in my book?" And he said, "Yeah, sure." You know, like you write a fictional story and you change the names, you change a lot. But there is an Ed Proctor who lives here in Harrisburg, and he's a really good friend of mine. But the story really is based upon, or loosely based upon, a friend of my father's. And I knew him as a young child. And I'm not going to tell you why I called the book Scarred, but it had to do with a friend of my father's. And this this thing about him always fascinated me, and I always wanted to know what happened, which I never did. And you know, as a small child, and I was an imaginative child. I didn't really need friends. I could just imagine things. So I just imagined what had happened to him later on in life, and that was the premise for the reason why I called the book Scarred. Um, Mavis actually, are you familiar with oh gosh, I can't think of the group right now. The Staple Singers.
Yes.
And you know Mavis?
Mm-hmm.
And I just and it was my one of my father's favorite groups. And I kept thinking, what am I gonna name this character? And I went back, and like I said, this story is really dedicated to my parents. And I thought about, because I grew up with listening to all that old music, and I thought about Pop's Robot from the Staple Singers. And I thought about Mavis. I'm going to name her Mavis. So that's where the name Mavis comes from. So Ed and Mavis. Ed Proctor is a real person living here in Harrisburg, and Mavis is from the Staple Singers.
And Silas with his small role, but
Oh no, Silas was one of my mother was married. Now, like I said, they were storytellers. Silas was my mother's first husband. So I just, and she would, I mean, the stories, that's a book by itself. If I would tell you the stories about my mother and her first husband, and she told me his name was Silas. So I thought, I think I'm going to name this character Silas. Silas is one of those minor characters who really could have his own story.
Yeah. Well, so I like the way you weave this story. You got Mavis, and you have Ed Proctor, love interest. What I really like that you depict, that we don't talk about him as much as the courtship. And I see a lot of like colorism within our own culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so the reason why I mentioned Silas, because the correlation between Proctor, he knew with him being dark skinned, and that with Silas being light skinned, that he was not acceptable because he was dark, and not acceptable because he don't go to church on Sundays, you know, and her mom would not have that. But the courtship was very um, beautiful, how you had the courtship. Let's talk about that in our own culture, where we probably just kind of shy away from, you know, we have our light skins and our dark skin. So let's talk about, why did you highlight his mother in the way they didn't like, you know, certain colors, certain, your reputation was everything. I see he didn't go to church, and he was a well-mannered guy. He did, I can't remember the lady's name, her went over there, did her house and everything. So why was it so important to show that contrast between people of color, how we do our
Well,
own?
I think if you go back and you think about living in the South and in the time of Jim Crow, racism had so much to do with how a person was perceived physically. You know, go back and think about slavery. You know, if you were a very light skinned Black person, you were definitely treated a lot better. So now we're talking about the Jim Crow era. So, and it's funny because it wasn't that long ago that, that era really existed. So back then, it was like if you were lighter, you were treated better. And even within Ed's family, he was very dark, but I described him as being very good looking. So it was almost like the darkness outruled how he looked. Like nobody paid attention to the fact that he was extremely good looking, but it's simply
Mm-hmm.
he was darker complected. And there were, like you said, colorism, but that was something that he felt it made him feel less of a person. And I think we do that oftentimes in modern day society. We do that. We think about how a young girl who's dark complected and they may wonder like, why am I so dark? Or you'll hear
Mm-hmm.
somebody say, oh, she's so dark but she's pretty.
Oh
um,
yeah,
yeah, we
you're
do that.
beautiful
There's
for a dark skinned
colorism.
girl.
Yeah,
You're
there's
beautiful
color.
for a dark skinned girl. Yeah.
So I wanted to depict that especially in this particular era of time in the late '60s, was that was a real issue within the African American race. So
Mm-hmm.
I tried to not, emphasize the fact that Ed was struggling with this, but I did also want to make people realize that that was part of the reason why he knew he needed to leave that particular time. In Bruton, Alabama, was he needed to leave, and was one of the issues that he was struggling with. So, but I didn't want to make race. I didn't really want to emphasize race in the book. It was just one of those underlining factors.
Mm-hmm. That we really don't talk about. And so Ed, his family, it's such a dark story about his mother. Even she didn't like, told him he was ugly. He was not ugly. And his dad was so cruel that, I mean, will he? Well, I hadn't read the other two, but I'm wondering as a reader, will we know a prequel or something about Ed's dark, backstory?
It wasn't really, it was part of the plot just to get you to see that despite the fact that Ed grew up in this very dysfunctional family, he was a good guy. He didn't bring any of that baggage with him in his relationship with Mavis. He really was a good guy. He overcame that. So as you read on, you read the other two books, you're going to find that he was the only way I can describe him was he was a really good guy. And I think, we often think that somebody coming from such a dysfunctional background, they bring that with them, but that's not always the case. There are times where people break that chain of dysfunction. And that was another thing I wanted to show. Just because you come from a background with struggles doesn't mean that you're going to always carry those struggles with you. And Ed was that type of person. And also, I didn't depict Ed as somebody who was a churchgoer, but there was faith there.
He was a really good guy. I often would see Miss Matthews, him helping her even after I think her husband passed, right?
Yeah, she was a widow and she had a small house with a little land and she needed help. And Ed was always available to help her. And Mrs. Matthews is just she's one of those just, she's not even a supplemental care or, she's a minor character.
But I think that she, as a reader, I thought that she brought life to Proctor, like had something for him to do, kept him a little bit, you know,
Yeah.
I
And
don't know. I guess I can imagine when while or some point that she probably spoke into his life because he was on time. He was always doing it. He had her stuff just together. And it looked like that's what Mavis admired about, his steadfastness and how he was, kind of taking care of her. I think that was one of the awestruck that she saw. because that
I
was a
love
little
how
part.
you bring up
That was a little
these
part
little.
where she was looking at him,
I love how you
awestruck.
point out these little minor characters that I gave one scene to. I wasn't
Yeah.
even thinking about Mrs. Matthews because she
Oh, I
was.
loved her because I wondered where is, as a reader, maybe I'm just that different type of reader because I've observed all things around him. Like, okay, he's over there, he's helping her. Where's his mother? Where's his father? And maybe it's just me
Wow,
that read that way. But
I
I
hadn't
wanted to
really
know
thought
where he.
about her.
Yes, yes. I liked her a lot. I think she gave him
Oh,
something to do. And
wow.
then when I saw that scene, how cruel his mother was to him, and then I was like, he doesn't get any love there. And
Oh,
that's
you
what made me
really
think
dug
about
deep.
Miss. Hmm?
I said you really dug deep because
Yeah.
the only reason why to be truthful, the only reason why Mrs. Matthews was in there was that they needed to place the meat on the side of the road. Because you remember the scene where she was there,
Yes,
it was on their way to church.
it
So
was.
he was all, and it was only a temporary job. She had some work that he needed to do around the house. So it was
That
like,
was good. That was a
yeah.
good part. I just paid attention
Oh,
to that. I like that. But also, when you mention that with them going to church, and as I read a little bit further, Mavis' mother, she was hurting because she really made. I mean, I know when we're growing up, we have our siblings, and we kind of we wasn't really the mother figure, but we kind of helped out, made sure they were okay, and so she made sure she was okay. And I see a little bit further that she put a lot of I don't want to say requirements because she did need to do something in the family, meaning Mavis. But I saw where she was kind of grieving where her husband had left her. And I saw that she really put, because Mavis was looking like, okay, now I see why she does this. Now I
mhm.
see why she's acting that way. She
Well,
even had her eyes on the pastor.
Mavis was really very mature for her age. Now, keeping in mind both Ed and Mavis, they were young. You know,
Mm-hmm.
they weren't even 21 at the time. So, um, that being seen through Mavis's eyes was she didn't like how her mother treated her, but she understood. She was just a wise young girl. She
Mm-hmm.
got it. She understood that her mother had overcome certain hurts and she was alone and she was raising three kids.
Mm-hmm.
And Mavis was the oldest, so she put a lot on Mavis's shoulders.
She did.
Mm-hmm.
She did. But I want to visit um her father a little bit. Hashtag small spoiler. I felt that as a reader that what happened to his hand, you don't really say what happened to his hand. And then I felt like he felt that he was less dispensable in his family and because his hand, but he didn't think about the whole dynamics of his family. But I just felt that that was a small coward thing to do, as he was feeling in his own, like he was less of a man because he couldn't contribute the way he used to.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
I
that's
saw how I
exactly
like
what.
how you brought that out. How
Mhm.
how does this man feel that he feels inadequate as opposed to how he used to be? Tell us about her dad.
Well, I kind of thought back about that whole era of men who labored and who did not have a lot of education. So, even thinking about my own father, he came from a family of 16. And when their parents died, he had to quit school to help out on the farm. So he never finished high school, very, very smart man. But, he always felt as though, he wanted to go back to school, but financially he wasn't able to. So when we think about what happened with Mavis's dad, he sort of just felt like I can't support my family. So it was almost like an all or nothing thing. Like there's nothing that I can do. Not giving away too much of the book. He leaves because of he feels inadequate, that there's nothing he can do. And then keeping in mind, um, what blacks could do at that particular time.
That's
If you were
true.
if you were a laborer, you made your money on your back. You know, you had to be a strong person because that's how they, they weren't sitting behind desks at the,
Hmm.
and these individuals were extremely poor. They were sharecroppers. So it wasn't an opportunity to say, well, I've got a college education. I think I'm going to go work and sit behind this desk. That wasn't an option for them.
Hmm.
So labor was the only option. And when that was taken away from him, he felt less of a man, and he felt like, how am I going to support my family? I'm real they're going to be better off if I leave.
I think they were better off, but I can understand it now more that you're saying it in detail. I was just thinking, just work with one hand, but like you said, what could he do? And thinking in that era, we find it don't want to give a lot of hashtag spoilers away, but we do find that something happens. Um, and in that, it causes them, Mavis and Ed, it costs them their family, cost them their reputation, it costs them to have to move from where they are. And so I seen that. So do you, without giving the whole story away, I remember talking to you, and you can kind of give a true, if you would, situation as to uh, a black man staying in his place. That was something at a store, but you had a story that you could tell us about that being put in
Oh,
your
I think I
place.
was sharing with you a while ago, a story that my mother had told me about her father. Her father was a stonemason, and he would go around, and this was, oh gosh, this was probably, I want to say, the 30s. Could have even been earlier than that. These are just stories that are retold to me. And this is when my mother was a really young girl. Um, he would go from church to church, or from place to place, building these churches. And of course, things were extremely segregated at that time with Jim Crow. So he build a church on that was going to be a white church. And after he built the church, they would tell him, you've got a certain amount of time to get off this land or we're going to kill you. And when my mother told me that story, I was like, but I would say, Mom, that doesn't make any sense. He's building the church, but they're going to kill him if he doesn't leave. And she said, yeah, that's how it was back then, and they would pay him, like sometimes he would get livestock, or if it was, a fairly rich, I don't even want to say rich, I guess a well-off community, he might get some tools or something, but it was very little money, maybe, you know, whatever it was, like that wasn't a lot. But it was one of those things where at the time, my mom also told me about what her family life was like. Her father was traveling around, trying to make a living, and how are you going to feed a child when somebody pays you with a chicken or a hammer? It's kind of hard to feed your family. So he would go where he needed to go to try to make a living. But I am sure, if you look back and you think, okay, I'm doing all of this, and I'm working as a laborer because I don't have an education, and I still can't feed my family. So I got to keep moving, and I got to send money when I can. And my mother told me the story about her mother basically was a single parent, and there were three of them, three girls. And one day she just took them and she dropped them off at her grandmother's house, and she kept moving. And my grandma and my great grandmother raised my mother and my two aunts. But my mother always wondered, like, why did my father come back and get me? you know but the fact that, I'm sure, he felt less of a man because he really couldn't support three girls. He couldn't. So I tried to build that factor into the book with Mavis's dad, that it wasn't a matter of not loving his family. It was a matter of, I'm feeling I can't help you. So maybe it's easier if I'm not here. Maybe you will do better without me. So, and if we look at today and we think of families where the father is not present, there's a whole lot of other factors of why, you know, fathers get up and leave. But at that particular time, it was a matter of survival. Like, and I don't know if he, like we can say maybe her father, found something else in another town and sent money back because that was something else. My father did that for years. Um, we would go down south every summer to help his father or help his family with the little patch of land they had. So they were very committed to their families. So I'm sure it took a lot for him to say, I'm just going to leave. So I never tell you like, okay, he left, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't try to support. So maybe he went off in another town and he found a job.
Yeah, because I wondered about that, but I saw, like we say, his inadequacy, and the mother is just trying to hold on and do what she can
Mhm.
do to.
That I also do that because if I ever decide that I want to pick these characters back up, they have places to go.
Yes.
So I a lot when I think about writing these smaller characters, like many of these characters could become main characters. Like could easily become a main character. Mrs. Matthews could easily become a main character. Ed's or Mavis's father and mother could easily become a main character. So you always, well, for me, I always want to leave a character where the readers are going like, I wonder what happened to them.
Yes. Yes.
You don't
Yes.
close off your doors with your minor characters.
Wow. You were going to do a reading. Are
Oh,
you ready for
yeah,
that?
I even marked my pages and everything. All right, I'm going to read to you an excerpt of when Ed and Mavis are leaving town and how they get out of town. And that's that character that you love so dearly, Silas.
Mm, okay. And it will
Try,
be,
you
go
ready?
ahead. Hmm.
Trying hard to believe Ed, I squeezed his fingers. I could feel the fever rising in his body. By the time we made it to the main road, I was tired, dirty, and hungry. We kicked up Alabama dirt into our nostrils. All I wanted was a good bath and something to eat. The early morning sun started to rise along with the warmth of the morning. Girl, even with all that dirt on your face, you still the prettiest thing south of Dixie. Ed turned to me and said, Why, thank you, Mr. Proctor. That's mighty sweet of you to say. I knew he was doing his best to keep my spirits up, so I gave him my best smile and a dose of sarcastic southern and a dose of sarcastic southern accent. We both snickered at each other for still dreaming our young dreams. For just a moment, I felt like things hadn't changed. I pictured the two of us still sitting on my front porch sipping on my mama's sweet tea. Our daydreaming was suddenly interrupted by the blast of a horn. Ed and I hurried to the side of the road and overwhelmed with the fear that Buford and his buddies were back. Looking behind us, we both sighed with relief to discover it was Silas. Silas Wilkerson. Silas and I had gone to high school together. Both Ed and I stood on the side of the road as Silas slowed his old pickup truck down and stopped. My heart was still beating a mile a minute, relieved to know it wasn't Buford Stubbs. Hey, you two, what you doing walking all out here this time of morning? Silas rolled down the window and called out after us. Silas, me, and Ed got to get out of Escampia. Can you give us a ride to Birmingham Station? Running over to Silas, knowing that he didn't have time for a long explanation, I quickly said, What y'all doing getting yourselves in trouble? Silas looked around hesitantly, his eyes big as saucers. Swallowing before speaking, Silas looked at the bandage on Ed's face, and the feeling of fear began to overtake me again. I couldn't catch my breath. I felt as though the ground was going to swallow me whole. Please, Silas, you gotta help us. You're the last chance. You're our last chance. Please take us to Birmingham, I begged him. Silas took a deep breath, reached over, and unlocked the back door of his truck. Ed and I climbed in. I don't know what the two of you have gotten yourselves into, and I'm sure that I don't want to know. I will be grateful if you keep yourselves out of view of the window as much as you can until we out of Escampia, turning and looking at the both of us before moving down the road. Ed and I lowered ourselves down in the back of the truck so that passersby did not see us. Silas started down the road. We knew the risk that we were taking it. We knew the risk that he was taking in helping us. If Buford Stubbs ever found out that he helped us get out of Escampia, Silas would indeed be in a boatload of trouble. The closest train station was Birmingham was in Birmingham, Alabama. It was a 3-hour drive. Silas did not ask us to explain why we needed to leave so quickly, and we chose not to volunteer any explanation. The less Silas knew, the better. Time had passed as we slept in the back of Silas's truck. 3 hours and 15 minutes later, Silas pulled into the front of Birmingham station. Y'all stay safe, and I wish y'all the best. Turning and looking back at us, Silas pulled away from the curb, leaving us standing in front of Birmingham station. A sudden lump formed in my throat. Ed looked tired and ragged. Mama was right. Life on our own would not be a comfortable journey. I looked toward the sky and thanked the Lord for his blessings. Lord, thank you. You always show up when we need you. But I
I
think,
love that.
I was talking to my husband's cousin who is close to 80.
Hmm.
And she told us this story. And I always tell her, I said, I love it when older people tell stories. I stop and listen because these are our living history books. And she was telling us a story she's from the South, and about a family she knew that had 3 sons. And the something had happened where she knew she needed to get her sons out of the South as quickly as she could. The
Mm-hmm.
2 sons, I guess, were managed to get out, but the third son, the only way he was going to get out, the only plan they had was for him to get out of the South in a coffin. And I found it ironic because I have another friend who has a mother who's in her 80s, and she was telling the story about someone she knew who had to get out of the South in the back of a trunk. So when we start thinking about, that period of time and how a lot of people got from the South to the North, it wasn't always a pleasant trip.
Mm-hmm.
So now I know now they're making I think it's a series about Emmett Till.
Yes.
We
Yes.
all know the story of Emmett Till and how his mother sent him away, so that
Yeah.
he could be safe. So it's the story of I call it the Great Exodus.
Yeah. So, what do you when you mentioned that? I thought about we had talked some time ago. I was thinking about my dad when my dad's from Jackson, Mississippi,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember, and we're from Chicago, and I remember how we used to drive down there, and he would take certain ways. I believe I talked to you about this, and listening to you and others, there is a book that they had to use to be safe. I think it was a green book or something it was called, where they knew that, because I would see my dad, of course, he's not going to tell us because we're young. I would see him go like, in my mind, I'm like, why is he going way over there when there's a gas station right here? So he, being from Mississippi, he knew that there's some place that you had to be safe in the dark and that you could go and purchase things were you allowed as a colored man. So you told me about a green book that you guys had. Could you tell us about that green
My,
book?
well, like I said, my parents were from the South, and every summer that I can remember as a young girl, we would pack up the car, and my mother was the, back then, that's when there was no GPSs. You know,
Mm-hmm.
my mother would pull out the old map, but she'd be in the front seat, you know, and by the time, I mean, my father knew his way, but you know, every now and then you'd have a detour because in the summer they were doing some construction on the road. She'd pull out the map and she'd say, "No, Bill, go down." And his name was Matthias, but everybody called him Bill because his middle name was William. So she'd be sitting there and she'd be telling him to go this way because there's a detour, they're fixing the road or what have you. And I would be in the back seat, you know, just either sleeping, or we'd play that game, the license plate game, you know, what you do in the car, because you know, you didn't have your little Nintendos, you didn't have any of that stuff. But traveling down south made me realize, you know, the difference between being up north and being down south, because it definitely changed, you know,
Yes.
once you got down south. And those are the stories that I can remember about what's, you know, and, you know, I'm in my late 50s, so I didn't really live through like, you know, the whole segregation thing that they lived through,
Mm-hmm.
but they were still on the tail end of it, where my father still carried that green book, you know. He'd pull out the green book and say, okay, this is where we're gonna go, or this is where we're, you know, and we didn't stop. It was, you know, like um pretty much pull on the side of the road,
Mm-hmm.
sleep for a bit of time and keep going, you know. And I think it was that mentality, even though things had changed drastically by the time I was, you know, a young girl compared to when my parents were my age. My father's mentality was, you know, we're not stopping. We're going to keep going. You know,
Yeah.
I need to have that green book so I know what's, you know, where to say, where the places are that I'm going to feel comfortable going. And the funny thing about it was I met oh gosh, her first name is Gretchen. I can't think of her last name right now, but she wrote the book Driving While Black.
Mm-hmm.
She was here in Harrisburg, and I had an opportunity to tell her my childhood stories about traveling in the South, and my father's green book, because all of his family were from the South. So they would periodically go back home because he was very, very connected to his family. So they traveled back there often. And they would come, it was the only green book in the entire family. So they would come over to the house and say, "Bill, where's the book?" And he said, "It's in the junk drawer. Go and get it. But you better bring my green book back home." So they would go down south and come back. And my father would be calling, you know, his cousins, "Where's the book? You best get yourself over here and get my book." You know,
Mm-hmm.
and that green book stayed in the junk drawer of our kitchen for years. And then when my father passed away, it was still there because nobody would dare take out that green book. And when my mother passed away, I'm sure it was probably still there. And you know how when you're trying to pack up somebody, my mother
Yes.
ended up with Alzheimer's, so we moved her here to Harrisburg. But you know, you try to pack up a house that somebody has lived in for over 50 years. And my mother was a
Ooh.
collector. She didn't throw anything away. I bet you anything we took, you know, because you start taking stuff out of drawers. It's a junk drawer. It's nothing in there but junk. And you probably just threw it in the trash can. Well,
Yeah.
after I met the author of Driving While Black, she is actually works at the Smithsonian. She had told me like there are green books in the Smithsonian. And I was like, I probably threw the green book away. I was devastated when I was like, I wish you wouldn't have told me that. My family had a
Wow.
green book for years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, with you being a history buff, and we always call you our history buff because I didn't start reading history books uh, or even seeing it as a way of weaving it into a novel until I met you. And I really like it because we get a lot of history and we hear most about the lynching and this and that. Nothing to the point of how they survive and how they had to do life differently. And so, what made you be like history, that type of history buff? And I want to ask you, have we changed from that point? Do you see anything different in 2021 through 22 or just even those last 3 years with your own eyes, you know, and hearing the
Well,
stories of your mom and dad and pick up those stories.
well, as far as being a history buff, I think I inherited telling stories because, like I said, I would sit at the dining room table, and my parents would talk about, where they were when Kennedy was shot, where they were when
Mhm.
Martin Luther King was shot. Um, we lived in a melting pot neighborhood where, I'm a little kid during the Korean, the Vietnam War, where we had one vet that came back, and the only person he would have PD was a PTSD,
Mhm.
and the only person who could ever calm him down was my father.
Oh,
Like he was like we would be out in the middle of the in our neighborhood playing, and his name was Duke, and of course we called him Mr. Duke. And all of a sudden he would have these flashbacks, and he would pretend that he was thinking there were enemies. He was thinking we were the enemies, and he would have the gun, and he would be, and the kids were, if they couldn't find me, they would say, go get Mr. Bill and tell him Mr. Duke is having a bad day. He needs
oh,
and my father would bring him in the house and take him out in the backyard. They would sit on the back porch and have a cup of coffee. And my mom was a baker, so she would bake cake,
mm,
and she would give him a big, huge slice of cake and a cup of coffee. And my dad, if he was home, would sit and talk to him, and he would just kind of get him back to, you know, where, he was calm. And I think about being brought up in a melting pot neighborhood where, you had uh, whites, you had blacks, you had people who were from, immigrants from uh, Poland, German. And, you know, I knew that there was, racism, but in my particular neighborhood, and I think because we were all sort of at that same economical status where everybody was
yeah.
working, we helped each other out, and I didn't grow up with a lot of money, and I value things that don't necessarily mean that the world values.
Yes.
Like as a child, like getting um, an orange and a quarter meant a lot to
Yes.
me. you know. Um, so I think as you're asking me about what I see through my eyes of 2021 and 22 is that our world has changed. Of course, the pandemic has changed our world drastically, but just like I was saying to my husband's cousin about how I love to stop and hear older people tell these stories about the past
Mhm.
because I love hearing about my history, but I don't think our kids, today's generation, stop to do that. And so eventually, these stories that we treasure are going to be lost
Mhm.
unless we tell them. And I know, like, 1960s has not been that long ago. When
Yeah.
we start thinking over just a little over, 50, 60 years ago. And that's
Mhm.
how I got into the genre of historical fiction. Um, there's so many things that are happening now that bring us back to that time, all racial discord.
Mhm.
And that has even happened in my own family where, like I said, my father came from a family of 16, and he had one brother. All the rest of them were girls.
Woo.
And his brother and his son, his my father's nephew, my cousin, started a little trucking company. They were doing okay. It wasn't anything big. Um, but my father's nephew, my cousin, left one night to go get gas at a little local gas station, and he didn't like to carry his wallet in his pocket because he'd sit to drive. So he would put it in his breast pocket, and he was a smoker. So he had his wallet, and he had one of those little silver, um, cigarette lighters in his pocket. So he's going in to pay for his gas, and he pulls out the cigarette lighter first to get to his wallet, and he was shot. And I can still remember because it was like my father died from cancer. And it was the last year I can still remember him being healthy enough to drive down south before he got really sick. But I can remember the rage. I can remember the rage of losing his only nephew to something like this. And it was very similar to what we are witnessing today of young black men being killed for pretty much no reason at all other than race.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really too young to really understand the implications of why my father was so angry. And my father was a very mild, meek type of a guy, very, calm. But I remember my mother just saying to him, Bill, there's nothing we can do. Because we were going to this memorial service. And that to me is the commonality of what happened to my family when I was a young girl and what's happening to so many families now. It's that same rage, it's that same anger, but it's manifested in such different ways. Like
Yeah.
today, we see that happening and we witness just I think it was yesterday there was another shooting.
Mm.
Um, there was and I don't. Sometimes I have to tune out the news.
Yeah,
I watch it
I
enough
do the
to,
same too, Ro.
yeah, to be informed, but other than there's sometimes it's like I'm witnessing this again.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even really know the details of it, but it pretty much was very similar to all the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
But the common thread is not understanding why it's still happening.
Yeah. I always say, and we're pretty much almost done, but um, always say, and you're gonna be back with us, and I'll show in a moment before you go off, we're gonna have that talk about race. And so I'm glad that it's 20. And folks may or may not like me at this time, what I'm about to say. Um, Folks were mad at Trump for they felt that he brought this racial stuff. Ellen, say that it was already in the pot and it took him being in office to stir it up.
Mm-hmm.
So that now America has its cancer coming to the top. Finally, we can talk about race. You
Mm-hmm.
know, there's no color. We don't have a race problem. And so we will talk about it more on with our book of the month. But I say until they see us as human, because we came to America as cattle.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
until they stop seeing us like cattle and seeing us as human, then maybe a little bit at a time it'll stop. And I was talking to my husband about this the other day, that we only become human in the eyes of America when we're in sports. They can hug us, they can embrace us, they can stand by us, but once that ball of whatever sport you're playing is no longer in your hand, you're an animal. And that's what we'll talk about more and more. We have on our panel some new people in our book club, but you keep writing the history. Who knows, you may be able to write something that is going on in our world, even though you weave a little stuff in there, different things like that. So I appreciate you helping me to embrace history as a novel, because you bring up some stuff and you study it and you do your thing, and you really, you really, I love your writing, and I'm going to be
Thank
reading the
you.
other two. I love the writing. Can you tell the folks where they can reach you at, and what's new, what's coming up, what are you doing?
Oh, sure. Of course, you can reach me on Amazon. You can also reach out to me on Instagram under the literary one, or you can reach me at on Facebook at Braddy Productions, and you can also reach me at my website at robraddyproductions.com. I'm working on something right now that's totally different. I never thought that I could weave a little history into sci fi. So, and I never really thought, and I've created a whole new genre, Ellen. It's a little historical. There's some romance in there. It's historical romance, sci-fi, and a Christian fiction. There's such a genre.
What a recipe. It's not going to be scary, scary, right? Because I
No, no,
don't do
no, no, no.
horror
This
scary, scary.
and it was funny because I started off just wanting to write an historical romance. Now this happens in the 1900s. Um, and then all of a sudden I thought like, oh my God, I'm reading a textbook. You know how I love history, but it was just like too history. So I'm like, this plot just needs a twist. And boy, does this plot, I'm even still in the process of writing it, but it has a twist.
Oh my goodness. So will it be, do you think it's going to be like a trilogy or standalone or
I think it's I just see this as a standalone.
a
But I'm
standalone?
also doing that, but I am working on a series of short stories that I am going to try my hand at Bella, which is Amazon's new platform for serialized writing, where you write short stories and you post them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm working on that. Those are my two, and I'm also working on a poetry book.
Yes, 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 yes. So while you're there, this is the book that I'm talking about that Braddy will be on there with us. And we are digging deep and we are
Yeah,
going to,
happy.
yes,
I'm in
yes.
chapter 4 right now.
Oh my goodness, you are like way ahead of me, but I am coming back to it. It gives you, just a little glimpse. Did you find yourself getting a little attitude and had to back off a little?
Yeah, but then I started thinking about a program that I facilitate, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and it's working with young middle school kids and getting them partnered with um, diverse community leaders here in Harrisburg, and talking about their journey in systemic racism and discrimination. And all of a sudden my wheels started turning of thinking about how I wanted to be able to facilitate some of these topics and get kids to have those real discussions about race, but have them in a safe environment where they weren't going to feel judged, or they weren't going to feel intimidated, you know. So it started my wheels of turning because I work with kids and getting kids to understand where, what parts they play in, being individuals of color.
Yes. So we're going to have about maybe three or four of us, but we'll be on the panel. And this book, it's actually our January book. It's why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria and other conversation about race. And it's by Beverly Daniel Tatum. She's a PhD, and it's the 20th anniversary of this edition, the 20th anniversary. And it talks about some updated people like Trayvon and those that happened. Her statistic, I really enjoyed that. And that's what we're going to talk about. And we will see you again. And we're looking forward to your writing. Can't wait to hear that recipe of that twist that you have. We enjoy your writing. Definitely, we will be reading the other two. Hopefully, you come back in. And thank you so much for being here tonight. We really enjoy you, love your books. Those that are down there, if you haven't had a Braddy book, you will, and you will fall in love. Yes, yes, yes. There's some things on the board that people were saying. Let me not let you go without, let's see what the folks were saying. So, Wendy said, and these are our conversations during the time we were talking, and Wendy said that I would be one of those trying to leave the South. You know, when we're talking about things that were
Mhm.
going on in the South. And she said it's a huge difference. And Dr. Velma said, me too. I love my family's history when they were talking about the history. Uh, And Wendy also said, I'm seeing more families moving in together. And when we're talking about the sports and the music, that's where they embrace us as people of color in sports. Oh, that's right. Sports uh, and music. It's so true because it had a lot of things to do with music. And I think in your book, you mentioned some of the music, like they had, different music and stuff was going on.
Oh,
And they like that.
if you get to Surrendered and Waiting, like I said, I grew up, my father and my mother loved, neither one of them could sing. My daughter has a gorgeous voice, and I don't know where she got it from because I can't hold a tune in a bucket. But I grew up on all that old music, and my father would come downstairs, and my mother would be cooking something at the stove, and she'd be listening to like Billie Holiday, and the two of them would start dancing in the middle of the kitchen. And you know how you're a little kid, you'd be sitting at the kitchen table going like, "Oh yeah, yeah, ooey, ooey, stop," But they were the most romantic couple, and I wanted to incorporate that music in these books. So once you get to Waiting, you get a lot of that because then it takes you to where my parents met, and they met. Well, I'm not gonna tell you that. You have to
Yeah,
read it.
don't tell me. Don't you dare tell me. Let's
Yeah,
see what
but
else
there's
is
a lot of
on.
music in the other two books.
So let's see what else is here. Christy is our next one coming up. And Dr. Velma said, yes, on the West Coast, it is more subtle and uncovered on the West Coast as far as racism. I believe that's what she's saying. Again, Braddy, thanks for coming tonight. We will see you again. Good night. And I'll tell these folks what's
Good
coming up
night.
next. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, Alan. Thanks again.
Thank you guys for being here. Again, I'm Ellen Sutter of ESP Presents and ESP Book Chats, where we bring page turners your way. Also, get ready, guys, as Ro and I were talking about our book. This is our book of the month. Why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria and other conversations about race? Get ready. And that is by Beverly Daniel Tatum, PhD. This is the 20th anniversary of this edition. So I'm going to try to hold it so you guys can get it. If you want it, you'll see it. We will talk about this on the 24th of February. That is our book of the month. And also I put a link out there. It is Being Yours. That is our next spotlight, Christy Taylor. We're going to talk about a couple, a domestic relationship with Christopher and the husband. Logan is the wife, and Carter, a hashtag spoiler is that Carter found his mom in the kitchen, freshly bruised, and he was very young, but he is having some trauma about this image in his mind. So you will see that uncover. We'll just give you some hashtag small spoilers, won't give it all away. And then also stay tuned after Christy, which will be the 18th next week. At the end of the month on the 27th, we will have Elaine T. Jones. We're talking about their family history. They are part of history, and it's based off their novel, Aunt Dunsey's Trunk. That was an actual trunk that had some interesting things in there. And you will hear their history unfold. Again, thank you guys for being here. Ellen Sutter of ESP Presents and ESP Book Chats. Also, starting on the 25th, only on Instagram, we're going to do a shout out, scout out. That's when we have an author to come up on our Instagram page. 2 minutes to tell us about your book. And if you want to take it a little further, to have a spotlight with us, we will go from there. So you may see some of the people you've seen tonight in our other shows, but be ready, be ready. Again, I'm Ellen Sutter of ESP Presents. Thank you guys for being here. And to everybody, good night. Thank you for every share. Thank you for watching us. Thank you for those who are overseas and those who are local, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Thank you guys so much. We cannot do this without you guys. We truly appreciate you. And that is all for tonight. We are going to be signing.